Before we jump into our next story, I want to take a quick moment to talk about what this channel is really all about. We are absolutely fascinated by history, those huge turning points, the raw chaos of battle, and the impossible choices people had to make when they were caught up in massive events. That deep fascination is the heart and soul of history under fire. But it's really important for you to understand something. This channel is a stage for storytelling, not a classroom. Everything you see here, the gripping tales, the characters you'll either love or hate, and the dramatic moments that seal their fates is historical fiction. It's all crafted with one main goal in mind, to entertain you. So sit back and get ready for another journey into the past. Now, let's begin.
December 21st, 1944. The morning air in the Belgian Ardennes was so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhalation drawing frozen daggers into Private Francis Sherman Curry's lungs. At 19 years old, he crouched in a hastily dug foxhole near a stone bridge outside Malmedy, his hands numb inside wet wool gloves, his M1 Garand resting across his knees. Around him, the remains of his platoon, 12 men out of an original 40, prepared defensive positions with the grim efficiency of soldiers who understood they were likely about to die. 4 days earlier, less than 3 miles from where Curry now waited, SS troops of Kampfgruppe Piper had murdered 84 American prisoners at a crossroads. The Malmedy massacre had spread through American units like wildfire, transforming the nature of combat in this sector from professional military operations into something darker and more desperate. Surrender was no longer an option. The SS had made sure of that. Curry had been with the 30th Infantry Division since Normandy. Landing on Omaha Beach on June 10th and fighting through the hedgerows of France, the liberation of Belgium, and finally into Germany itself before the massive German counteroffensive had driven them back into Belgium. He was a combat engineer by training, which meant he knew explosives, demolitions, and how to build or destroy bridges. But the chaos of the Ardennes offensive had thrown military specializations into disorder. Engineers fought as infantry, cooks became riflemen, clerks manned machine guns, and 19-year-old privates found themselves defending critical positions with whatever they could scrounge. The bridge behind Curry was tactically significant, a stone structure spanning a frozen stream that connected 2 segments of the road network the Germans needed to reach the Meuse River. Intelligence reported an SS armored column moving through the forest to the east, probing American defenses, looking for weak points to exploit. Curry's platoon had been ordered to hold the bridge at all costs until reinforcements could arrive. That phrase, at all costs, had a specific meaning that everyone understood. They were a delaying force, expendable, expected to trade their lives for time. Lieutenant John Carpenter, the platoon commander, moved along the defensive line, checking positions. He was 24 years old, a college graduate from Pennsylvania who had been commissioned through OCS after proving himself as an enlisted man in North Africa. He stopped at Curry's foxhole, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Curry, you got the bazooka?" Francis nodded, gesturing to the M1A1 bazooka lying in the snow beside him, along with 4 rockets. "Yes, sir. 4 rounds." "Make them count," Carpenter said. "Intelligence says we're facing at least 3 tanks, maybe more. Probably Panzer IVs or Panthers. If they get across this bridge, they'll be in Malmedy by nightfall, and the whole defensive line collapses." He paused, his expression grave. "You know what happened at the crossroads. If they overrun us, don't let yourself be captured. Understood?" "Understood, sir." Carpenter moved on to the next position, and Curry was left alone with his thoughts and his fear. He thought about the stories circulating through the division, about the American prisoners forced to stand in a field while SS troops opened fire with machine guns, about wounded men shot in the head as they lay bleeding in the snow, about the few survivors who had played dead for hours before crawling to safety. The massacre had violated every rule of war, every assumption about how civilized nations conducted combat. And it meant that the men now approaching through the forest were not just enemy soldiers, but potential executioners. Sergeant Mike Halloran crawled over from the adjacent foxhole, his weathered face tight with cold and tension. Halloran was 32, ancient by infantry standards, a veteran of campaigns in North Africa and Sicily who had survived more combat than most men would see in 3 wars. He had taken Curry under his wing when the kid joined the division, teaching him the practical skills that kept soldiers alive. How to move under fire, how to read terrain, how to trust your instincts when doctrine failed. "How you holding up, kid?" Halloran asked, his voice low. "Scared shitless, Sarge. Trying not to show it." Halloran grinned without humor. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Just don't let it freeze you up. When the shooting starts, you move. You shoot. You don't think about anything except the next thing that needs doing." He gestured toward the eastern tree line, about 300 yards distant. "They'll come out of that forest. Probably lead with armor to clear the road, infantry following to secure the bridge. Our job is to make it cost them so much time and blood that they decide this bridge ain't worth taking." "With 12 men?" "With 12 men," Halloran confirmed. "We got 2 machine guns, your bazooka, plenty of rifle grenades, and the bridge is wired for demolition if it comes to that. We make a lot of noise, move positions after firing, make them think we got a whole company defending this crossing. Perception matters as much as firepower, kid, remember that." Curry absorbed the lesson, understanding the underlying psychology. They couldn't stop the Germans through superior force. They were outnumbered and outgunned. But they could create uncertainty, make the enemy cautious, slow them down enough that reinforcements might arrive or the Germans might decide to find an easier route. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was the currency of the Bulge. The Germans came at 0930 hours, announced by the distinctive rumble of diesel engines echoing through the frozen forest. Curry pressed himself into the bottom of his foxhole, peering through the thin screen of brush they had arranged for concealment. The first vehicle to emerge from the tree line was a Panzer IV medium tank, its long 75mm gun traversing slowly as it searched for targets. Behind it came 2 more tanks, another Panzer IV and what looked like a Panther, the latter's sloped armor and powerful 75mm gun making it one of the most dangerous tanks in the German arsenal. Following the armor came infantry, at least 2 platoons of Waffen-SS troops in their distinctive camouflage smocks, moving with the practiced coordination of elite soldiers. Curry counted approximately 60 men, which meant his 12-man platoon was facing a force 5 times larger, supported by armor they couldn't hope to match. Lieutenant Carpenter had positioned himself in a foxhole near the bridge, where he could observe and direct fire. He raised his hand in the prearranged signal. "Hold fire," until the tanks were committed to the approach, until they were close enough that the bazooka had a realistic chance of penetrating armor, until breaking contact became impossible for the Germans without losing face and momentum. The lead Panzer IV rolled forward, its commander visible in the open hatch, scanning the approach to the bridge. The tank moved with the arrogant confidence of armor that expected minimal resistance. A reconnaissance in force, probing for American positions before committing to a full assault. Behind it, the SS infantry spread out in combat formation, weapons ready but not yet firing. Carpenter dropped his hand. The American line erupted. 230 caliber machine guns opened up simultaneously, their tracers reaching across the snow-covered field like deadly fingers. Rifle fire crackled from a dozen positions. Rifle grenades arced toward the SS infantry, exploding among their ranks with sharp crumps that threw bodies into the air. And Curry, hands steady despite the adrenaline screaming through his system, shouldered the bazooka, aimed at the lead Panzer IV's exposed side armor, and fired. The rocket streaked across the 300 yards in less than 2 seconds, trailing white smoke. It struck the Panzer IV just behind the turret, penetrating the thinner side armor and detonating inside the crew compartment. The tank lurched to a stop, smoke billowing from the hatches. The commander who had been visible moments before was gone, dead or dying in the inferno that now consumed the vehicle's interior. The battlefield transformed instantly from cautious probing to violent chaos. The surviving German tanks opened fire, their main guns sending 75mm shells crashing into the American positions. One round struck the stone bridge itself, showering Curry with fragments of ancient masonry. Machine gun fire swept across the defenders' line, forcing everyone down into their holes. Curry reloaded the bazooka with shaking hands, the mechanism familiar from countless training drills, but infinitely more difficult with numb fingers and incoming fire making every movement feel like pushing through water. He popped up, aimed at the 2nd Panzer IV, fired. The rocket went wide, missing by 3 feet and exploding harmlessly in the snow beyond the tank. Shit! Curry dropped back into his hole, aware he had just wasted one of his remaining 2 rockets. To his left, Corporal Jimmy Reeves was firing his Browning automatic rifle in controlled bursts, suppressing the SS infantry who were trying to advance under cover of their armor. To his right, Private Garcia was dead, killed by a machine gun burst that had nearly decapitated him. His body lay half out of his foxhole, blood steaming in the cold air. Lieutenant Carpenter was screaming orders, but the noise of combat drowned out most words. What came through was tone, urgent, commanding, desperate. They were being overwhelmed. The Germans had recovered from the initial surprise and were now applying systematic pressure, using their armor to suppress American positions while infantry maneuvered to flank. Then the Panther fired its main gun at point-blank range into the American line. The shell struck the foxhole where Sergeant Halloran and 2 other men had been positioned. The explosion was massive. Dirt, snow, and pieces of human bodies thrown into the air. When the smoke cleared, the foxhole was a crater. Halloran was visible on its rim, his body twisted at an impossible angle, clearly dead. The other 2 men had simply ceased to exist. Curry felt something break inside him. Not courage, but the last restraint of civilized behavior. These were SS troops. These were the men who had murdered prisoners at the crossroads. These were the soldiers who gave no quarter and expected none. And they had just killed the sergeant who had kept Curry alive for 6 months of continuous combat. He grabbed his remaining 2 bazooka rockets, his M1 Garand, and all the grenades he could carry. Then, without conscious decision or permission, he climbed out of his foxhole and started moving forward toward the German line. It was insane. It violated every tactical principle he had been taught. Advancing alone against armor and infantry was suicide. But something in Curry's 19-year-old brain had recalculated the odds and decided that staying in the defensive position meant death anyway. Slow, inevitable, helpless death as German tanks systematically destroyed each foxhole. Moving forward, attacking, doing something unexpected that at least offered a chance, however small, of survival or of taking enough Germans with him that his death meant something. He ran in a crouch, using the smoke from burning vehicles and the irregular terrain for concealment. Behind him, he heard Corporal Reeves screaming his name, but the words were lost in the noise of battle. Ahead, the 2nd Panzer IV was repositioning, its commander unaware that an American soldier was now running toward him with a bazooka. Curry stopped behind a low stone wall, shouldered the launcher, aimed at the tank's vulnerable rear armor where the engine compartment was less protected. He fired from 40 yards, close enough to guarantee accuracy, close enough to see the shocked face of a German infantryman who spotted him in the instant before the rocket struck home. The Panzer IV erupted in flames as the rocket penetrated the engine and detonated the fuel tanks. The tank commander scrambled out of the hatch, his uniform on fire, and fell screaming into the snow where several SS infantrymen tried desperately to extinguish him. Curry dropped the now useless bazooka and unslung his M1. He fired 8 rounds as fast as he could work the trigger, not aiming carefully but putting bullets into the cluster of Germans around the burning tank. At least 2 went down. The others scattered, seeking cover, suddenly aware that an American soldier was in their midst, rather than safely behind defensive positions. He ran again, this time toward a destroyed farmhouse on the German flank, reloading his M1 as he moved. Bullets kicked up snow around his feet. Something tugged at his jacket. A near miss that would have killed him if he had been 1 inch to the left. But he made it to the farmhouse ruins and threw himself behind a collapsed wall, breathing hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. From this position, he could see the Panther tank maneuvering to engage the remaining American defensive positions. He could see Lieutenant Carpenter's position. The lieutenant was still alive, still fighting, but wounded, blood visible on his uniform even from this distance. He could see the SS infantry beginning to flank the American line, moving with the confidence of soldiers who knew they had already won. And Curry understood with sudden clarity that the battle was lost. His platoon was destroyed. The bridge would fall. The German assault would continue. Unless someone did something so unexpected, so aggressive, so seemingly impossible that it broke the momentum and made the Germans reconsider whether this bridge was worth the cost. He had 1 bazooka rocket left. He had a rifle with 1 full clip remaining. He had 4 grenades and a trench knife. He had the element of surprise because no sane soldier would be where he was, doing what he was doing, and he had nothing left to lose except his life, which was probably forfeit anyway. Private Francis Sherman Curry, 19 years old combat engineer from upstate New York, made a decision that would echo through military history. He was going to attack, alone, against armor and elite infantry, because someone had to, and he was the only one in position to do it. He checked his remaining ammunition, said a quick prayer to a God he wasn't sure he believed in, and prepared to do something that would either save the bridge or get him killed in the most spectacular fashion possible. Probably both. Curry waited 30 seconds behind the ruined farmhouse wall, controlling his breathing, letting his heart rate settle enough that his hands would be steady when the moment came. Through gaps in the shattered masonry, he studied the battlefield with the focused intensity of a predator selecting prey. The Panther tank had repositioned and was now firing methodically at the remaining American defensive positions, its 75mm gun sending shell after shell into foxholes that had already been devastated by the earlier assault. SS infantry were advancing in 2 groups, one pushing straight toward the bridge, the other swinging wide to flank from the south. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't know because it defied all tactical logic, was that an American soldier was now behind their advancing line, armed with 1 bazooka rocket and a willingness to do things that training manuals would call suicidal. Curry studied the Panther with professional assessment. The tank was the most dangerous threat on the battlefield, but it was also the most heavily armored. His single remaining rocket might penetrate its rear armor if he could get close enough and hit the engine compartment, but the odds were poor. The smarter target was the SS infantry. Disrupt their assault, create chaos, make them think they were being hit by a larger force than actually existed. Movement caught his eye. 3 SS soldiers were using a low stone wall for cover as they advanced toward the bridge, unaware that Curry was watching from their flank. They wore the distinctive camouflage smocks of elite Waffen-SS troops and moved with the confidence of soldiers who had never lost a battle. Their weapons were the excellent German MP-40 submachine guns, perfect for close-quarters combat, but less effective at range than Curry's M1 Garand. Curry raised his rifle, steadied it against the farmhouse wall, and began to fire. The M1's semi-automatic action allowed rapid-aimed shots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The first SS trooper went down immediately, hit in the chest. The second turned toward the unexpected fire and took a round through the throat. The third managed to get his MP-40 up and return fire, bullets chipping stone inches from Curry's face, before Curry's 6th shot caught him in the shoulder and spun him around. The distinctive ping of the M1's en-bloc clip ejecting echoed across the battlefield as Curry dropped behind cover and reloaded with practiced speed. 8 rounds loaded. Bolt released. Weapon ready. He was already moving, running in a crouch to a new position 20 yards away before return fire could find him. The SS infantry's advance had stalled. Officers were shouting orders in German, trying to identify where the fire had come from, trying to determine if they were facing a counterattack or just a single desperate soldier. That uncertainty, that moment of hesitation, was exactly what Curry needed. He spotted a fallen SS trooper about 30 yards ahead, killed in the initial exchange. The body was lying next to an MG-42 machine gun, the dreaded weapon Allied soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw for its incredibly high rate of fire. If Curry could reach that gun and get it operational, he could create devastating firepower that would make the Germans think they were facing a much larger force. The sprint across open ground took perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt like hours. Bullets snapped past him. Something tugged at his helmet with enough force to spin his head sideways, a round that would have killed him if it had hit 2 inches lower. But he made it to the dead German, grabbed the MG-42, checked it quickly. The weapon was intact, still had a partial belt of ammunition loaded. The German soldier also had 3 stick grenades, Model 24 steel hand granite, tucked into his belt. Curry took those too. He set up the MG-42 behind a slight fold in the ground, aimed toward the SS infantry group advancing on the bridge, and opened fire. The gun lived up to its reputation, spewing bullets at over 1,200 rounds per minute, the sound like ripping canvas amplified to nightmare volume. The advancing SS troops went to ground immediately, seeking any cover as the stream of fire tore through their formation. Curry fired in short bursts, 3 to 5 seconds each, to conserve ammunition and to keep the barrel from overheating. Between bursts, he could hear German voices shouting, officers trying to organize a response, enlisted men calling for medics. The psychological effect was working. The Germans were reacting as if they faced a prepared defensive position rather than one 19-year-old with a captured weapon. He fired until the ammunition belt ran dry, then immediately grabbed the German stick grenades and started moving again. Staying in one place after using the MG-42 would be suicide. The Germans now knew exactly where that position was and would be bringing overwhelming fire to bear on it within seconds. As if to prove this point, the Panther's main gun swiveled toward where Curry had been and fired. The 75mm shell obliterated the position he had occupied 5 seconds earlier, the explosion throwing frozen dirt and shattered equipment into the air. But Curry was already 50 yards away, running toward another cluster of SS infantry who were pinned down by fire from the surviving American positions. He pulled the pin on one of the German stick grenades and threw it with the overhand motion of a baseball pitcher, the grenade arcing through the air and landing in the middle of the SS position. The explosion scattered the Germans, killing at least 2 and wounding several others. Curry fired his M1 as he moved, not stopping long enough to take careful aim, but putting rounds downrange to keep enemy heads down. He was operating purely on instinct now, on the muscle memory of 6 months of continuous combat, on the understanding that aggression and movement were his only defenses against overwhelming numbers. From his position in the Panther tank's commander cupola, SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber was experiencing something he had rarely felt in his career: confusion, bordering on concern. Weber was 34 years old, a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, Russia, and now the Ardennes. He had led armor in the breakthrough at Sedan, survived the hell of the Eastern Front, and participated in dozens of successful assaults against larger enemy forces. He understood combined arms tactics, knew how to coordinate armor and infantry, could read a battlefield with the experience of hundreds of engagements, but this battle was not making sense. His assault force had started with 3 tanks and 60 elite infantry against what reconnaissance suggested was a platoon-strength American position, perhaps 30 to 40 men. The odds heavily favored the Germans, yet somehow, impossibly, the assault had stalled. 2 of his tanks were burning wrecks. His infantry was scattered and disorganized, and most confusing of all, he could not determine the size or disposition of the American force. Fire was coming from multiple positions, from the defensive line around the bridge, yes, but also from his flanks, from his rear, from positions that should have been unoccupied. The Americans seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, moving rapidly, using German weapons alongside their own, creating a level of chaos that suggested either a much larger defending force or tactical coordination that Weber had not anticipated from what was supposed to be a hastily assembled delaying action. Through his binoculars, Weber watched an American soldier, just one man, emerge from cover, fire a rifle, throw a grenade, and disappear before return fire could find him. 30 seconds later, fire came from a completely different position, then another, then another. It was impossible to tell if this was one man moving rapidly or multiple soldiers coordinating perfectly. Hauptsturmführer, his gunner called from below. The infantry is requesting fire support. They're reporting heavy resistance from multiple positions. Weber swore in frustration. The infantry was the fire support. The tank was supposed to suppress American positions while the soldiers secured the bridge. Instead, his infantry was pinned down, his tanks were burning, and the bridge was still firmly in American hands. He considered his options. He could commit to a full assault, using his remaining tank and all available infantry in one overwhelming push. But if the Americans had more anti-tank weapons positioned at the bridge, and they almost certainly did, charging forward risked losing his last tank for no gain. He could request additional support from the battalion, but that would require admitting that his reinforced platoon had been stopped by what appeared to be a significantly smaller American force, which would reflect poorly on both his tactical judgment and the combat effectiveness of his unit. Or he could do what Weber's training and experience suggested: withdraw temporarily, regroup, gather better intelligence about American strength and positions, then assault again with a more comprehensive plan. The decision was made easier by what happened next. Curry had found a position in a destroyed barn about 80 yards from the Panther tank. The barn's stone walls provided decent cover and concealment, and from here he had a clear view of the German infantry attempting to reorganize. He also had a clear shot at the Panther's vulnerable rear armor. The tank had turned to engage targets to the north, presenting its engine compartment to Curry's position. This was the opportunity. His last bazooka rocket. One shot to make it count. He assembled the M1A1 bazooka with cold-numbed fingers, loaded the final rocket, extended the weapon to its full length. The Panther was approximately 90 yards away, close enough for accuracy, far enough that the explosion wouldn't catch him in its blast radius. Through the bazooka's simple sight, he could see the tank's rear armor, could identify the specific point where armor was thinnest, where a rocket had the best chance of penetrating and reaching the engine or ammunition. Curry took a breath, held it, steadied the launcher against his shoulder. His hands had stopped shaking. The fear was still there, would always be there. But it had transformed into something colder and more focused. This was the shot. Everything came down to this moment. He fired. The rocket streaked across the space between barn and tank, trailing its distinctive white smoke. Time seemed to slow as Curry watched it fly, watched it approach the Panther's rear armor, watched it strike exactly where he had aimed. The penetration was not spectacular. No massive fireball, no immediate catastrophic explosion. Instead, there was a sharp crack as the shaped charge punched through the armor, followed by thick black smoke beginning to pour from the tank's engine compartment. Inside, alarms were undoubtedly screaming. Crew members were shouting, and the tank commander was making split-second decisions about whether to try to fight the fire or abandon vehicle. Weber chose abandonment. The Panther's hatches popped open and crew members began evacuating. 4 men scrambling out of a vehicle that was rapidly filling with toxic smoke. They ran from the tank, seeking cover, aware that ammunition could cook off at any moment and turn their armored protection into a steel coffin. Curry dropped the bazooka, completely useless now, just dead weight, and picked up his M1. He fired at the fleeing tank crew, not with anger, but with the cold calculation of a soldier eliminating threats. He hit one, maybe two, before the others made it to cover. The Panther sat smoking, immobilized, as effective at combat as a burned-out Hulk. 3 tanks destroyed, all 3 by one American soldier with a bazooka and absolute refusal to accept defeat. The SS infantry's morale broke first. They were elite troops, true, trained and experienced and ideologically committed. But they were also human, and humans have limits to how much chaos and uncertainty they can absorb before self-preservation overrides tactical discipline. They had watched all 3 tanks burn. They had taken fire from what seemed like multiple positions. They had seen their comrades fall to an enemy force they could not accurately count or locate. And most importantly, they had begun to wonder whether this bridge was worth the cost. Curry, watching from his position in the barn, saw the shift happen. The German infantry stopped trying to advance and started looking for ways to withdraw. Officers were still shouting orders, but enlisted men were already moving backward, using covering fire to mask what was essentially a retreat. The assault was collapsing not from enemy strength, but from accumulated uncertainty and the psychological weight of taking casualties without making progress. He needed to maintain the pressure, to keep the Germans convinced they were facing something they couldn't overcome. He grabbed the 2 remaining German stick grenades and his M1, left the barn, and began moving toward the American defensive line, firing as he went, putting rounds downrange more for noise and psychological effect than with any expectation of hitting specific targets. Behind him, the Panther erupted in flames as the fire reached ammunition storage. The explosion was massive, sending pieces of the tank 50 feet into the air, creating a pillar of black smoke that could be seen for miles. The psychological impact on the SS troops was immediate and visible. Men who had been retreating in good order began simply running, abandoning equipment, focusing entirely on getting away from this cursed bridge where 3 tanks had been destroyed and nothing had gone according to plan. Curry made it back to the American defensive line to find Corporal Reeves and 3 other survivors still holding their positions, still firing at the retreating Germans. Lieutenant Carpenter was dead, killed by machine gun fire while Curry had been behind German lines. Of the original 12-man platoon, only 5 remained combat effective, and 2 of those were wounded. But they had held. The bridge was still in American hands. The German assault had been broken. Reeves stared at Curry with an expression that mixed relief, disbelief, and something close to awe. Jesus Christ, Curry. What the hell did you do out there? We thought you were dead. We saw you running at their tanks with a bazooka and figured we'd be writing letters to your family tonight. Curry collapsed behind the stone wall, exhaustion hitting him all at once, now that the adrenaline was fading. His hands were shaking again. His body ached from wounds he hadn't noticed receiving. Bullet grazes, shrapnel cuts, bruises from being thrown to the ground multiple times. He was alive, which seemed impossible given what he had just done. I improvised, Curry said finally, his voice hoarse. Moved fast, used their weapons, made them think we had more men than we did. Made them uncertain. Made them pay for every yard. Made them decide this bridge wasn't worth dying for. You destroyed 3 tanks, Reeves said flatly. By yourself. With a bazooka and whatever else you could scavenge. Do you understand how insane that is? Seemed like the right thing to do at the time, Curry replied. And despite everything, despite the death, the fear, the carnage, he found himself laughing. Not from joy, but from the pure absurdity of having survived something that should have killed him 10 times over. The sound of artillery fire rolled across the landscape. American guns, responding to calls for fire support that Lieutenant Carpenter had managed to radio before he died. The shells began landing on the German positions, completing the disruption that Curry's one-man assault had begun. Within 30 minutes, American reinforcements arrived. 2 companies of infantry and a platoon of tank destroyers, far more strength than was needed now that the German assault had been broken. The company commander, a captain named Morrison, surveyed the battlefield with visible confusion. 3 destroyed German tanks, dozens of enemy casualties, and a handful of defenders who by all rights should have been overrun an hour ago. "What the hell happened here?" Morrison demanded. "Intelligence said you were facing a reinforced SS platoon with armor support. You should have been wiped out." Corporal Reeves pointed at Curry, who was sitting on the ground trying to reload his M1 with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. "Private Curry happened, sir. He single-handedly stopped the assault, destroyed all 3 tanks, disrupted their infantry, made them think they were fighting a much larger force. I've been in combat since North Africa, and I've never seen anything like it." Morrison studied the 19-year-old private, who looked more like a kid playing soldier than someone who had just accomplished one of the most remarkable individual combat actions of the war. "Is this true, Private?" Curry looked up, exhausted and still processing what he had done. I couldn't let them take the bridge, sir. After Malmedy, surrender wasn't an option, so I fought. Used what I had, moved fast, didn't give them time to figure out how many of us were actually left. Made them pay enough that they decided to withdraw." Morrison was silent for a long moment. Then, "Private Curry, I'm recommending you for the Medal of Honor. What you did here today, the courage, the initiative, the tactical brilliance of using mobility and aggression to overcome superior numbers. This is going to be studied at West Point. You saved this bridge, saved this defensive line, and probably saved Malmedy itself by breaking the momentum of that assault." Curry didn't know how to respond. The Medal of Honor seemed like something that happened to other people, to heroes from history books, not to 19-year-old kids from upstate New York who had simply refused to die when the tactical situation said they should. "I was just doing my job, sir," he said finally. "No," Morrison corrected. "You were doing something far more important than your job. You were showing what one determined soldier can accomplish when he refuses to accept defeat. That lesson is worth more than any amount of firepower or numerical superiority." As the afternoon light began to fade and the temperature dropped even further, the survivors of the bridge defense began the grim work of collecting identification tags from the dead and preparing the wounded for evacuation. Curry helped carry Sergeant Halloran's body to the collection point, his mind still struggling to process that the man who had taught him so much about survival was now just another casualty statistic. Corporal Reeves found him sitting on the stone bridge, staring at the frozen stream below. "You saved my life today, you know," Reeves said quietly. "When you went after those tanks, when you disrupted their assault, you gave us time to reorganize, to keep fighting. If you hadn't done what you did, they would have overrun us within 15 minutes. Halloran taught me to improvise," Curry said. "To move, to shoot, to not think about anything except the next thing that needs doing. I just did what he would have done if he'd been in my position." "No," Reeves corrected gently. "Halloran was a great soldier. But what you did today, attacking armor alone, using enemy weapons, creating chaos through pure aggression and movement, that's something beyond training. That's something that can't be taught. That's why you're going to get the Medal of Honor and why people are going to remember this bridge decades from now." Curry wasn't sure he wanted to be remembered. He wasn't sure he wanted any recognition at all. He had simply refused to surrender to impossible odds, had fought with everything he had because the alternative was accepting defeat and execution at the hands of men who had murdered prisoners 4 days earlier. But as he sat on that bridge in the fading light of a December afternoon in Belgium, surrounded by the wreckage of battle and the bodies of friends who had not survived, Francis Sherman Curry began to understand that what he had done mattered beyond his own survival. He had shown that adaptability, aggression, and psychological warfare could overcome numerical and firepower superiority. He had proven that one soldier, in the right position with the right mindset, could alter the course of a battle. And in the dark winter of the Battle of the Bulge, when American forces were reeling from the massive German counteroffensive, when morale was low and defeat seemed possible, stories like this one mattered more than strategy or tactics. They mattered because they reminded soldiers that individual courage and initiative could change outcomes, that the war was not yet lost, that one determined man could make a difference. The bridge stood. Malmedy was saved. The German assault had been broken by a 19-year-old private who refused to accept that 12 men couldn't stop 60, that a bazooka couldn't kill 3 tanks, that surrender was the only logical response to overwhelming odds. Francis Currie had done the impossible, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone watching that sometimes the impossible was just difficult, and difficult was just a matter of refusing to quit. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month after Francis Currie's defense of the bridge near Malmedy. The massive German offensive that Hitler had launched on December 16, 1944, his desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp, ground forward through the Ardennes with terrible momentum before Allied counterattacks and German fuel shortages finally halted the advance. By January 25, 1945, American forces had pushed the Germans back to their starting positions, though the cost had been staggering. Nearly 90,000 American casualties, the highest for any battle in the European theater. But within that larger narrative of division movements and strategic objectives, small actions had accumulated to determine outcomes. A platoon holding here, a bridge defended there, a supply convoy getting through, a German assault broken by unexpected resistance. The war was won by thousands of such moments, by individual soldiers making split-second decisions that rippled outward to affect operations they would never see or understand. The bridge near Malmedy was one of those moments. Francis Currie spent the remainder of December and early January in combat, though nothing matched the intensity of that December 21st action. The 30th Infantry Division continued pushing against German positions, clearing towns, securing roads, grinding forward through winter conditions that were almost as deadly as enemy fire. Currie fought with the same improvised aggression that had saved the bridge, though now battalion commanders knew his name and occasionally gave him assignments that required exactly the kind of initiative he had demonstrated. Word of what had happened at the bridge spread through the division with the speed of legend. Soldiers told and retold the story, each version adding details or emphasis until it became difficult to separate fact from mythology. But the core remained true. One 19-year-old private had destroyed 3 tanks, disrupted an SS assault, and held a critical position with a handful of defenders against overwhelming odds. The story mattered not just for what Currie had done, but for what it represented. Proof that individual action could overcome systemic disadvantages, that courage and creativity could defeat superior numbers and firepower. On February 8, 1945, Currie was pulled from the line and told to clean his uniform. He was being presented with the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, for his actions at the bridge. The ceremony took place in a requisitioned Belgian farmhouse, attended by division officers and a handful of reporters who had been following the 30th Infantry Division's role in the Battle of the Bulge. General Leland Hobbs, commander of the 30th Infantry Division, read the citation. Private Francis S. Currie, Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty on December 21, 1944, near Malmedy, Belgium. When his unit was pinned down by heavy enemy fire from 3 German tanks and approximately 60 Waffen-SS infantry, Private Currie, on his own initiative, left his defensive position and attacked the enemy armor with a rocket launcher, destroying 1 tank. Moving to another position, he engaged enemy infantry with a captured German machine gun, inflicting numerous casualties. He then destroyed a 2nd tank with his last rocket, later disabled a 3rd tank with rifle grenades, and captured German weapons. Throughout this action, Private Currie repeatedly exposed himself to intense enemy fire, constantly moving between positions to create the impression of a larger defending force. His extraordinary heroism, selfless devotion to duty, and tactical brilliance in the face of overwhelming odds were instrumental in repelling the enemy assault and holding a critical defensive position. The medal felt heavy in Curry's hands, heavier than it should have been for a piece of metal and ribbon. He understood it represented not just his own actions, but the sacrifices of men like Sergeant Halloran and Lieutenant Carpenter, soldiers who had died defending that bridge, whose bodies had bought the time Curry needed to improvise his desperate assault. "How do you feel, Private?" a reporter asked after the ceremony, notebook ready. Curry considered the question carefully. How did he feel? Proud, certainly. Grateful to be alive. Haunted by the faces of men who had not survived. Uncertain whether what he had done was heroism or just survival instinct taken to its logical extreme. "I feel like I did what needed doing," he said finally. "And I feel like the real heroes are the ones who didn't make it back. I was just the one who got lucky." "Lucky?" the reporter pressed. "You destroyed 3 tanks by yourself. You disrupted an entire SS assault. That seems like more than luck." "Luck is staying alive when you do something that should kill you," Curry corrected. "What I did was necessary. Whether it was heroic or insane probably depends on perspective. But it worked, and that's what mattered." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Curry survived to see it, though not without additional close calls. He fought through the final German defensive positions, participated in the occupation, and eventually returned to the United States in late 1945. He was 20 years old, a combat veteran with the Medal of Honor, and struggling with the disconnect between the person he had been before the war and the person combat had shaped him into. Readjusting to civilian life proved more difficult than fighting had been. At least in combat, the rules were clear. Survive, complete the mission, take care of your squad. But civilian life required navigating social expectations and career choices and a future that seemed impossibly distant when for 2 years your future had been measured in hours or days. Curry worked various jobs, factory work, construction, eventually opening a small business in upstate New York. He married, raised a family, and largely avoided talking about his wartime experiences except when circumstances demanded it. The Medal of Honor was displayed in his home, but not prominently. It was part of his history, but not the entirety of his identity. But the story of what he had done at that bridge near Malmedy did not fade. Military historians studied the action as a case study in individual initiative and tactical improvisation. The U.S. Army incorporated elements of Curry's approach into training doctrine, teaching soldiers that mobility, aggression, and psychological pressure could multiply effective combat power. What had been desperate improvisation in December 1944 became codified tactics by the 1950s. In 1984, 40 years after the bridge defense, the U.S. Army War College invited Curry to speak to a class of officers studying small unit tactics and leadership. He was 60 years old now, gray-haired and slowed by decades of hard work and the accumulated effects of combat wounds. But when he spoke about that December day, the details came back with crystalline clarity. "The question people always ask," Curry told the assembled officers, "is how did you find the courage to attack 3 tanks by yourself?" And I tell them, I didn't find courage. I found necessity. Courage implies a choice. You can be brave or cowardly. But I didn't have that choice. Staying in the defensive position meant dying. Surrendering meant being executed by SS troops who had murdered prisoners 4 days earlier. The only option that offered any chance of survival was attacking, disrupting, making them uncertain enough that they decided the cost was too high. He paused, looking around the room at officers who would soon be leading men in combat. "What I want you to understand is that the tactics I used that day, constant movement, using enemy weapons, creating psychological pressure, making them think they faced a larger force, those tactics worked not because I was particularly heroic, but because I was adaptable. I saw what the situation required and I improvised. That adaptability, that willingness to throw out the doctrine when doctrine isn't working, that's what kept me alive and what broke that assault. A young captain raised his hand. "Sir, the citation says you destroyed 3 tanks and held off 60 SS infantry with only a handful of defenders. From a tactical perspective, that should have been impossible. What was the key factor that made it possible?" Curry smiled slightly. "Perception. The Germans didn't know how many of us there were. They couldn't tell if they were facing a platoon, a company, or just one crazy private with a bazooka. Every time I moved positions, every time I fired from a new location, every time I used one of their own weapons against them, it added to their uncertainty. And uncertainty is paralyzing, especially for soldiers who are trained to operate within clear tactical frameworks. The SS troops at that bridge were elite, well-trained, experienced, but they were also conditioned to expect certain patterns, that defenders stay in defensive positions, that Americans use American weapons, that numerical superiority translates to tactical dominance. I violated all those patterns, and the cognitive dissonance made them hesitate, made them recalculate, made them decide withdrawal was better than continued casualties. Another officer spoke up. "But sir, you were 19 years old. Most 19-year-olds don't have the tactical sophistication to understand psychological warfare or perception management. How did you know to do those things?" "I didn't know," Curry admitted. "I didn't sit down and plan out a psychological warfare campaign. I just kept doing whatever seemed like it might work next. Kill a tank, move, use a German machine gun because it was there and loaded, move again, throw grenades, move, fire from unexpected angles. It was all improvisation, all reactive. But the cumulative effect of constant unexpected action created the psychological pressure that broke their assault. Sometimes the best tactics emerge from desperation rather than planning." The broader military implications of Curry's actions at the bridge extended beyond tactical doctrine. His performance became a case study in what military theorists call asymmetric warfare, situations where a smaller, weaker force defeats a larger, stronger opponent through unconventional methods that negate the enemy's advantages. Modern special operations forces study the bridge action as an example of how individual soldiers with initiative can create effects disproportionate to their numbers. The constant movement, the use of enemy equipment, the creation of uncertainty through unpredictable actions, these became hallmarks of special operations methodology. But perhaps more importantly, Curry's story influenced how the U.S. military thought about training and empowerment. Traditional military doctrine emphasized following orders, maintaining unit cohesion, operating within established tactical frameworks. Curry's success demonstrated that sometimes the most effective actions came from individual soldiers making independent decisions, violating doctrine, improvising solutions that no manual had anticipated. This tension, between the need for discipline and the value of initiative, shaped American military culture for decades. The ideal became soldiers who could operate within command structures when appropriate, but could also function independently when circumstances demanded it. Curry embodied that ideal, a soldier who followed orders until the situation made following orders impossible, who then improvised with such effectiveness that he altered the battle's outcome. SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber survived the war, surrendered to American forces in May 1945, and spent 3 years in a POW camp before being released. In interviews conducted decades later by military historians researching the Battle of the Bulge, Weber spoke about the bridge assault with visible frustration. "We had numerical superiority, armor support, elite infantry," Weber said through a translator in a 1987 interview. "The tactical situation favored us completely. That bridge should have fallen within 30 minutes. Instead, we lost 3 tanks, suffered heavy casualties, and withdrew in disorder." For years, I believed we had faced a reinforced American company with prepared defenses and excellent anti-tank positions. Only later did I learn that most of the resistance came from one soldier, a 19-year-old private with a bazooka and the audacity to attack armor alone. The interviewer asked if Weber had changed his tactical approach based on that experience. "Absolutely," Weber confirmed. "After that bridge, whenever I encountered unexpectedly heavy resistance, I would pause and gather intelligence before committing forces. Because I learned that Americans could be unpredictable, could fight with an aggression and creativity that our doctrine did not account for. That one soldier, Curry, he taught me that assumptions about enemy capability could be catastrophically wrong, that sometimes a smaller force with greater determination could defeat a larger force that expected easy victory." This admission from an enemy commander was perhaps the greatest validation of Curry's approach. He had not just held a bridge or killed 3 tanks. He had altered how elite enemy soldiers thought about combat, had introduced enough uncertainty that future assaults would be conducted with greater caution and intelligence gathering. The psychological impact of his actions extended far beyond that single December afternoon. Francis Sherman Curry died on October 8, 2019, at the age of 94. He was one of the last surviving Medal of Honor recipients from World War II. His funeral was attended by military officials, veterans organizations, and soldiers who had studied his actions at various points in their careers. The bridge near Malmedy had been designated a historical site years earlier, marked with a plaque describing the action and honoring the men who had defended it. In his later years, Curry had been increasingly willing to discuss his experiences, to speak at military events, to help younger soldiers understand that heroism was not about fearlessness, but about continuing to function despite fear, about improvising when plans failed, about refusing to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. One of his final interviews, conducted by the Veterans History Project, captured his perspective on what that December day had meant. "People want to make me into some kind of superhero," Curry said, his voice still strong despite his age. "But I wasn't superhuman. I was a scared 19-year-old who saw his friends dying and decided that if I was going to die too, I'd take as many of the enemy with me as possible. The difference between me and someone who freezes or surrenders in that situation isn't courage. It's that I channeled fear into action instead of paralysis." He paused, considering his words carefully. "What I want people to understand is that every soldier has that capacity. The ability to improvise, to adapt, to keep fighting when the situation seems hopeless. It's not about being exceptional. It's about refusing to accept that the situation is truly hopeless, about looking for opportunities even when opportunities seem impossible. That mindset, that refusal to quit, that's what won that bridge. That's what wins most battles, really. Not the side with more tanks or more soldiers, but the side with more determination to keep finding ways to fight. Today, the battle at the bridge near Malmedy is studied in military academies worldwide as a textbook example of individual initiative overcoming systemic disadvantages. The action demonstrated several principles that have been incorporated into modern military doctrine. 1. Mobility as force multiplier. Curry's constant movement created the impression of multiple defenders and prevented the Germans from concentrating fire on any single position. Modern infantry tactics emphasize shoot and move doctrine, partly based on lessons learned from actions like this. 2. Psychological warfare. Through unpredictability. By violating enemy expectations, attacking instead of defending, using their weapons, moving aggressively rather than withdrawing, Curry created uncertainty that paralyzed enemy decision-making. This principle underlies modern asymmetric warfare strategies. 3. Exploitation of available resources. Rather than limiting himself to issued equipment, Curry used captured German weapons, scavenged ammunition, and improvised tactics. This adaptability became a core principle in special operations and unconventional warfare. 4. Individual initiative within commander's intent. Curry understood the mission, hold the bridge, but executed it through methods no commander could have anticipated or authorized. This balance between mission understanding and tactical flexibility became central to U.S. military leadership philosophy. The Medal of Honor citation tells the story in formal military language, but the real lesson is simpler and more profound. One determined soldier, refusing to accept defeat, can change the outcome of a battle and alter how future battles are fought, not through supernatural ability or perfect training, but through adaptability, aggression, and the stubborn insistence that impossible situations are just difficult ones that require creative solutions. On the bridge itself, now preserved as a memorial site, a marker reads, "On December 21st, 1944, at this location, Private Francis S. Curry and 12 soldiers of Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, defended this bridge against attack by Waffen-SS forces. Despite overwhelming enemy superiority in numbers and armor, the defenders held their position through extraordinary courage and tactical improvisation. Private Curry single-handedly destroyed 3 enemy tanks, disrupted the assault through aggressive action, and demonstrated that individual initiative and determination can overcome any disadvantage. 7 American soldiers died defending this bridge. Their sacrifice, and Private Curry's heroism, exemplify the finest traditions of American arms. Visitors to the site often ask guides the same question that the young captain asked Curry at the War College in 1984. How was it possible for one soldier to accomplish so much against such overwhelming odds? The answer remains what it was in December 1944. It was possible because Francis Curry refused to accept that it wasn't possible. Because he adapted rather than following doctrine. Because he attacked rather than accepting defeat. Because he understood, instinctively if not intellectually, that perception and psychology could be as powerful as armor and artillery. And because, in the end, warfare is conducted not by machines or statistics, but by human beings who can be surprised, confused, demoralized, and broken, if someone has the courage and creativity to do the breaking. The bridge stands today as it stood in December 1944, spanning a Belgian stream that flows as cold and clear now as it did when Francis Sherman Curry fought for it. The stone bears scars from tank fire and small arms impacts, permanent reminders of a day when 12 men faced 60, when one soldier's refusal to surrender altered the course of a battle and demonstrated truths about warfare that no amount of planning or doctrine could have revealed. In military terms, the action at the bridge near Malmedy was a minor engagement in a massive battle that was itself just one component of a continental war. The bridge held. Malmedy was saved. The German offensive was eventually defeated, and history moved forward. But for the soldiers who study tactics, for the commanders who must make impossible decisions, for the privates who face overwhelming odds and must decide whether to fight or surrender, for all of them, the bridge remains significant because it proved that one person, in the right moment with the right mindset, can accomplish what entire units cannot. That adaptability trumps firepower, that psychology can defeat armor, that the human capacity for improvisation and determination remains the ultimate military asset, more valuable than any weapon ever manufactured. Francis Curry did not set out to become a hero or to change military doctrine or to demonstrate profound truths about warfare. He set out to survive a battle that should have killed him, to prevent SS troops from capturing a bridge, to honor the memories of friends who had already fallen. That he accomplished all of this, and in doing so provided lessons that would influence military thinking for generations, was not part of any plan. It was simply what happened when one determined soldier refused to accept defeat and improvised his way to victory. The bridge stands, the story endures, and the lesson remains clear. In warfare, as in life, the most important factor is not what resources you have, but what you do with them. And sometimes, one person doing the impossible can change everything.